Hello and welcome to Newsroom's Raw Politics, weekly audio and visual discussion on the politics of the week that's got us thinking. Welcome Jo Moir, our political editor in Wellington.
Hello.
And sitting with her, Sam Sachdeva, National Affairs editor and soon-to-be published author. Hi, Sam.
Hello, Tim.
Good to get that in early.
Get it done. I'm Tim Murphy, co-editor of Newsroom. This week on Raw Politics, there's three topics we want to look at. One that has broken late, which we'll add in. We're going back to the well of the National Party after last week dissecting whether National had its act together. But this week, more is broken on their reputational issues. First, though, we're going to look at the politics this week of education. Why education is back in the news. Why now? Both parties really in the last couple of weeks putting forward policies on the three R's, reading, writing and arithmetic, what they're trying to achieve and why. I suspect there will be in their focus groups and a lot of polling showing that some of the criticism we've seen from ACT and National over student achievement rates and those subjects are starting to take an effect on the government and it's needing an answer. But we'll turn first to Jo Moir, who an ex-education correspondent, I think, Jo, who knows these things. Jo, why now, and if you can tell us what the policies they've put forward have been?
Look, I think in terms of National, it's a deliberately strategic move because Chris Hipkins has been the Education Minister and was the Education spokesperson for Labour in opposition as well. Education is his baby. He cares deeply about it, and coinciding with that is some pretty abysmal results at the moment in the classroom in terms of reading, writing. And, you know, you put those two things together and for National and ACT, it's an easy target, really. I also think, though, generally, you know, parents are starting to say, what on earth is going on here? I mean, you've had these new NCEA standardised testing that has been done in schools as kind of a lead-in to, what will be the official NCEA testing. And you've got sort of somewhere around 50% of students who aren't passing these tests. They do not have the literacy and numeracy to actually pass the NCEA standards. So that is a big problem. I also think Christopher Luxon has been very determined to focus on education. He has spoken about that at length ever since he became leader. I think when he first got into announcing education policy a couple of weeks back now, when they rolled out this, back to basics policy, it was a very passionate position for him to be coming from. He's thought a lot about it. He put a lot of effort into that particular policy, and it's something that he can sell well because it's something that he kind of really gives a toss about. So, you know, you put all of that together and it makes for what will be, I think, a pretty interesting election issue come October, because you're going to have, you know, the former education minister, now prime minister, defending his own personal record in the education space up against National, who very conveniently have a whole bunch of statistics saying that actually in the classroom, you know, students are failing, basically. That's the short of it.
Jo, I was at Remuera Intermediate this week when Chris Hipkins and Jan Tinetti announced Labour's latest education move. It seemed rushed. It seemed like they were bringing out something a bit quickly. It happened during the school holidays in an empty school, for example. Why do you think they felt that need? And can you explain a bit of what that was, that policy?
Well, I mean, that policy was designed to give teachers confidence that they were going to have more one-on-one time in the classroom with students. But in effect, they're only able to bring on about an extra 320 teachers at the moment because we don't have a whole bunch of teachers sitting there waiting to come in. We're still having issues with getting teachers to come in from overseas. So what that actually means is that you're going to get one extra teacher across about every 6 schools, and your ratio of one teacher to 29 students reduces to 28 students, which is absolutely nothing. Unsurprisingly, every single teacher and principal in the country said this is utterly ridiculous. They've been calling for a ratio of 1 to 25 for years. It is nowhere near there. In fact, the response from the education sector was almost as vocal and disappointed and angry as when Hekia Parata and John Key said that they were going to increase the class size. I mean, that is how bad the policy was. And to do it in the school holidays, I mean, Tim, your piece was comical in the sense that, everything that could have gone wrong did. But also, that's just depressing. I mean, they were obviously responding to the National Party sort of getting some momentum with this education stuff. To feel like they had to rush when they did and do it during the school holidays. And then to have this announcement a couple of days later about the NCEA changes, which is well received by the sector, I don't understand the logic behind putting out a complete dud strategy at the start of the week and then putting out separately a few days later one that's been received well by the sector. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense.
And Sam, politically, it seems like a miscue.
Yeah. I mean, this is a key constituency, right? It's teachers, presumably a lot of them are in unions, so these are people who support Labour avidly. And in a sense, that kind of makes it easier for the government because even with this unease, it's not like they're going to swap their vote to National or ACT. A lot of them are opposed to charter schools and plans or proposals to dial back registration requirements. But these are the people that you want energised for you. Maybe they'll be volunteering in electorates, sitting in at phone banks, doing leaflet drops. So if you've got them offside and you're having to fight these sort of internal wars, so to speak, it's the last thing you really need in an election year.
I thought Jan Tinetti showed a real love for the sector and embrace of being the minister, talking about schools and kids and things the other day, did pretty well as far as it went with what she talked about in terms of the class size changes, which wasn't much of anything, was it? But she did quite well. But then on the NCEA adjustment, I thought she floundered a bit. She was talking so much technical stuff about various rates and jargon. She was on Heather Duplessis-Allen's show, and Heather just basically, the end of it, said, I don't know what that was all about, and let's all just assume it was something they were going to do, it wasn't a good idea, now they're not doing it. Is she a good performer?
I think she's a good performer in the sense that she's come out of the sector. I mean, she's, been a teacher and a principal in a low decile school too, which I think means that she has that sort of deep understanding of how policy can really impact those more vulnerable students too. All of that stuff is good. Personally, I think that if Jan Tinetti was still a principal and had been, hosting the Prime Minister and Education Minister of the day earlier this week when that class ratio announcement was made, she would have said, this is a complete joke. What on earth are you idiots up to? So kind of a little bit ironic that she's the Education Minister delivering it. I think in terms of the announcement a few days later with the NCEA changes, people don't understand NCEA. It's been in place for a long time, but people don't get it. I mean, I still talk about, school certificate and bursary, as do my parents, and I like to think I'm not that old.
Did they have that in the 1930s, Joe?
Look, I went through it, so that's what I'm used to. But, people I just don't think anyone has ever really, parents I'm talking about, and students, it's still confusing to people. And the problem is that they've continuously made these changes because they've never got it right, which means you're struggling constantly to keep up with which part of NCEA you're actually up to. And if you look at the changes that were announced this week, it's things like deferring one bit of testing, refreshing the curriculum, but they have to proceed with some parts of the curriculum but not others. It's really, really confusing stuff.
So does it give them any gain, Sam, politically for the government or for National? Is there territory there to be made between now and October?
I think there is for National. I mean, you talk about issues that have cut through to middle New Zealand, your average voter, and that involves a lot of generalisation. But within that, education, a lot of, people, families, voters, have got children who are going through school, are very passionate about what's happening in the education sector. They might not be into the details of it, but they want to know that their kids will come out knowing how to, read and write well, they can do maths, they can do everything else. So it's I really don't want to get into the habit of this, but it's a real bread and butter issue for the public. So we'll chalk that one off. So it does make sense. I mean, for the government, there's probably more to lose than to be gained in a sense. It might depend on how they respond and what they do next. I'm not sure it's going to be one of the top issues in terms of what this election campaign has fought and lost on, but. It's going to be up there, and it's one of those things where again National can just put pressure on in the coming months and really have the government on the back foot, possibly.
So last week on Raw Politics, we dissected whether National was fit to govern, and normally we would leave them be for a while and go and explore the fates of the other parties contesting this election. But this very week, National's selection policies came back into frame. A very dubious set of claims or statements made by a candidate in what is probably a seat that they wouldn't win, but a candidate they've selected already. Joe, can they get past this? And is it systemic, or is it just actually that while their candidates may not be representative of the public, they are representative of this party?
Yeah, I mean, I did sort of laugh a little bit when I heard Bridget Morton, who is a centre-right commentator who had been pulled in to kind of respond to Stephen Jack, this is the candidate in Tairi, and the comments that he'd made and how it had played out. And her response was that, Christopher Luxon has acted very swiftly and decisively, and it's a real win for his leadership. Completely ignoring the fact that Christopher Luxon is the one who supposedly had cleaned up the candidate selection and vetting process, and here he is with a candidate who is not only in the mix but has actually been selected, who's had two pretty poor, inappropriate, unacceptable, whatever you want to call it, sort of black marks against him now. Obviously, he has resigned, and they're going to have to go through some very truncated selection process to find someone else. You could argue that Christopher Luxon played a role in telling Stephen Jack that he needed to go. But, I certainly wouldn't say that this is some big win for Christopher Luxon and his leadership. And it does raise questions about the fact that these sorts of candidates are still getting through. None of this stuff was particularly hard to find. It's on his social media. And we have heard time and time again that this is the sort of stuff that they're going to find and they're going to get rid of, and they're not going to put these people up. So why is it still happening?
Sam, is it possible to vet these sort of social media, especially when people have flicked something on? It's not their own phrase or work. They've just sort of liked or retweeted or sort of pushed through someone else's thinking. Is it possible to go through all that to vet someone properly and keep them where you want them?
Look, I think it's possible things could be missed. As you say, when you're not sort of the original creator of the content, if you're just sort of sharing it or liking it, then there probably is a higher bar there. But at the same time, this was, as I understand it, a public or at least semi-public Facebook account. They should be able to look at, what's on your Facebook page, what have you been tweeting, what have you liked and retweeted. It's not that hard. I don't think anyone expects that you're going to be able to do a thoroughly, forensic digital scrub of someone's presence on every corner of the web. But at a basic level like this, basically if it takes a journalist not that long to find it, and Andrea Vance's stuff seemed to track it down pretty easily, it should be easy enough for a selection panel or the local electorate committee to find this stuff.
And guys, it can't just be this party. Surely in the lists and the candidacies of the Greens or Labour or ACT, the Māori Party, whomever, there's got to be others who are saying and doing things online, or have they got a better system and have they got better sort of vetting?
I mean, I think you're right. I think there will be these sorts of candidates in other places as well, and it's a matter of whether they end up, actually getting selected or not. I mean, I don't think that any party has kind of mastered a perfect vetting or selection system by any means. But I think the problem for National is that theirs has been so in the spotlight because there have been sort of a series of really bad examples of it. and a real focus has gone on by the leadership and the caucus to get this right. You've had a change up within the president of the party. Peter Goodfellow was moved on. They got Sylvia Wood in, and she supposedly really went through with a fine-tooth comb and looked at that process and fixed it. And you can't come out and say that you fixed it and then continue to have a bunch of examples saying you haven't fixed it.
So, maybe not the last, we'll see.
No, watch this space, I think it's safe to say.
This week, the Police Complaints Authority's report into the parliamentary protest and the policing of it has been announced. It seems to be specifically on police actions in regard to the protesters as much as the politics of it. But it's in your home base there, Sam. You were there. What did you make of that report, and what does it say, if anything, about the sort of political response then and now?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all for us it's probably a kind of visceral reminder of just how horrifying that day was. You've got quotes in there from police officers, and we journalists were at a remove. They were on the front lines, and you have them saying, "Look, I thought I was going to die when they started throwing brick pavers at us and things like that." So it's a reminder. I think people have maybe forgot about it a little bit or moved on, but that was a pretty harrowing moment. I think the report itself seems to largely clear frontline officers. It says that the use of force was largely justified. The bigger concern seems to be about the higher level, the sort of management, both in terms of did the intelligence flow through in terms of this convoy and what it would mean for Parliament and politicians, and then on the day when they decided to clear the protests in March, these sort of delays in getting equipment to the front line, a lack of hard body armour, a delay in authorising the use of sponge bullets and other sort of more offensive arsenal, or at least things that will be more likely to drive attackers away. So I think the questions for politicians are going to be, one, what do we do to make sure we have better intelligence on things like this? Do we have linkages between police and spies? What is the role of our domestic agencies in looking at things like this? And secondly, I imagine there's going to be a clamour for greater resourcing for police. Clearly, they didn't have all the body armour that they needed. They may need other weapons, or sort of, again, soft weaponry like sponge bullets. So there's going to be a bit of an ask, I imagine, on the government to stump up some cash to make sure that the officers on the front line who are putting themselves at risk of injury or worse have that protection.
Joe, the report also talks about law changes. I think they're talking about trespass and aspects of how you sort of get on top of a mass gathering of this kind. And as well as that on smaller sort of legal aspects of removing vehicles and stuff like that. Do you think it's a race now between the parties to say who can sort of offer the most now and see whether some change can be made? That's one thing. The second would be the politics of this also involves those who were at the protests and the people they represent, who will obviously find this report to be a whitewash about the police and will find more conspiratorial in it. It's not going to do anything to keep them quiet in the next 6 months either, is it?
No, but I think bear in mind that there's a minority there. I don't think that is by any means some sort of big majority. I think you saw those groups of people sort of try and rally in terms of the local government elections and didn't really have much luck. I personally don't think that you'll see that play out at any sort of like big level at the general election either. So it's worth keeping that in mind. In terms of, any potential legislative changes, I'm sure National will love to find a way to look tough on crime with this. And it'll be interesting to see what the government, how the government responds. I'm not entirely sure, Sam, is there a sort of response from the government, a consultation, or are they going to come back with it?
I haven't seen that yet. I imagine they might take a little bit of time to look at it. I assume they would have got it in advance, but they may have a little bit of time to look and say, what do we need to do urgently? What's sort of perhaps in the medium term? My concern, and I think the concern of others, is that there will be a sort of a bit of a race, as I think both of you have said, to see who can be the toughest and crack down the most. And do we sort of end up in an overreaction where actually you have police authorised to sort of go in and start cracking skulls the moment there's any sort of protest? And I'm being slightly dramatic there, but actually we found out the other week, I did a story on this, that New Zealand police have been taking lessons on riot policing, riot control from their friends at the Hong Kong police force. And this is a police force that was accused on multiple occasions of misconduct, brutality, even alleged torture in its response to the Hong Kong protests in 2019 and 2020. So, look, are we going to emulate that? I don't think so. But that is something to be mindful of, and potentially the likes of the Green Party and some civil liberties advocates might have grounds for concern or wanting to intervene in that space.
And in the end, this really was a one-off, I think. At Parliament this time with lockdowns and mandates of that scale, and also we won't see the likes again probably of a speaker like Trevor Mallard.
No comment. No
Safely
comment.
now in Dublin.
Terrorising the Irish.
It looks like he's having a great time in Ireland. He's on his bike.
To our newsroom reader question this week. Sam, the question comes in, is there any real chance that Christopher Luxon can convince India to negotiate a free trade agreement with New Zealand under his watch?
I would say slim to none, or at least a free trade agreement that is going to be palatable to nationals, base of farmers and dairy producers. This has been the big problem with India. We had this; they were in the RCEP trade deal, which was a grouping led by the Southeast Asian nations. And had China in there. India was in right up until the last minute, and then they pulled out, and in large part because of farmers' protests. So they are very sensitive when it comes to dairy exports. Farmers, by all accounts, have an outsized voice there. So I think if we were going to do an FTA, it would be highly unlikely to have any meaningful gains, if any, for dairy. And the question is a national government going to sign a deal that doesn't include dairy? And if so, how are they going to sell that to federated farmers, Dairy New Zealand, and even the wider public? So I think, we have probably dropped the ball a little bit in regards to India. I spoke to a visiting professor, Ian Hall, from Australia, who's an expert on India, and he talked about the fact that the Australian federal government had put a lot of time and effort into visiting, to cultivating those relationships, and we really haven't. So I think there's a kernel of truth there, but to say, we're going to come in and we're going to have ministers on planes 365 days a year, they're only going to have one suit, and they're going to sign this deal, I think that's slightly optimistic, shall we say.
And Joe, just as an aside to that, what did you make of Luxon's kind of emphasis on he and his ministers being hustlers out there in the world?
Yeah, I actually said to Sam, I wonder whether if Christopher Luxon becomes Prime Minister, he might nominate himself Foreign Affairs Minister so that he can just, be flying about and being seen to be doing the thing. Although there's also a possibility that he gives the job to someone else, but then rings them at 4 o'clock every day to see how they're going because he thinks that that's something that should be done too.
Right, we move now to our recommendations, something we've read, seen or heard this week that we think you could spend valuable time with this weekend. I'll go first. I was taken by a piece in the Australian Financial Review by Neil Chenoweth, who is a chronicler over decades of Rupert Murdoch and his companies, and he was writing about the Fox News $785 million US settlement over the voting machines. He took a really interesting look at what happens now, what Murdoch does when things go wrong, and those around him, even the closest people around him, have let him down. It was very Succession. It's fascinating in his predictions, and I recommend it for anyone who has some time and an AFR subscription. Joe?
I'm recommending that anyone who didn't listen to Otago University academic Andrew Geddes on Morning Report this week, he did a really good interview with Corin Dan. It was in response to the Three Waters changes that the government's proposed Obviously, co-governance is still within that structure and is, causing a little bit of controversy still. National Party saying it shouldn't be there, etc. And I just thought Andrew Geddes did a really good job of very simply explaining co-governance and how it already exists, how it's interpreted, and just looking at it from a real sort of legal academic perspective. I'd recommend having a listen to that.
And Sam, what's impressed you, mate?
Look, it never hurts to flatter the boss. I'm going to mention your fine piece earlier this week on that exquisitely awkward schools announcement. What was it? An empty school and a policy half full. I think some teachers might be seeing it as half empty now. But just the level of detail and colour and that sort of cringeworthiness, it probably is only rivaled by the infamous Judith Collins walkabout in, was that Ponsonby or Grey Lynn?
Ponsonby Road.
Similarly made my toes curl.
Well, I think it made everyone in the room, the silences, the awkwardness, and at one point the minister actually saying something, getting no response, and answering herself with a cool and walking off.
Oh, God.
Well, have a read of all of those, or listen, and hopefully we've offered you something that can expand your political horizons. That's it from Raw Politics this week. Thanks to Hugo Stewart and Mark Jennings, our producers. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, readers and viewers and listeners, for your questions. We'll be back same time, same place, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, same time next week.